She lingers where sorrow meets shadows, a bride trapped in eternal mourning, her grief a curse that claims all who dare to cross her path. Ghost Bride of Chiang Mai, submitted by Supinya, Daengboon. In the small, misty hills of rural Chiang Mai, there's a story that has never been told to the wider world. It's one that the villagers whisper about only when the moon is hidden behind clouds, when the air is thick with fog, and when the mountains feel too close for comfort. The few who know of it say that it's a curse tied to the land, a curse that began many decades ago on a day that was supposed to be filled with joy, but instead was drowned in tragedy. The story starts with her, the bride Supansa. On the day of her wedding, dressed in a white silk gown with delicate flowers in her hair, she was the picture of happiness. Her wedding, they say, was the talk of the village for months. The groom, Niran, was a man loved by all, known for his kindness and steady hands. The villagers had celebrated the union, believing it would bring prosperity to the entire community. But before the vows could be exchanged, something went horribly wrong. Some say she slipped, that her silk shoes caught on a wet stone by the riverbank, causing her to lose her balance and fall into the rushing waters. Others believe she was pushed, though no one would ever dare to accuse Niran, despite the quiet rumors. And then there are those who think it was something more, a curse from the spirits of the forest, jealous of the happiness Supansa and Niran shared. Whatever the cause, Supansa never made it to the altar. Her body was pulled from the river hours later, her gown soaked through, and her hands still clutching the bouquet she had been holding. The villagers mourned, but Niran, he was never the same. Some say they saw him by the river for weeks after her death, standing on the edge, staring into the waters, as if waiting for her to return. But Supansa did return. At first, only a few people saw her, just glimpses, barely there. A white figure standing at the edge of the river, her long hair flowing down her back, the same flowers that had been woven into her wedding hair still in place. Then more people began to see her. Travelers who camped near the village, and the villagers themselves, especially those who dared to linger near the river at night. It was said that she wandered, still dressed in her wedding gown, her face pale as the moon, her lips forever locked in a sorrowful smile. Her eyes, they said, were the most haunting of all, empty, as if searching for something she could never find. And that's when the disappearances began. It was never anyone from the village, at least not at first. The ones who vanished were travelers, passing through the area and choosing to rest by the river for a night. They'd pitch their tents near the water, only for their belongings to be found the next morning, untouched, with no trace of the person who had set up camp. The villagers knew what had happened, but they kept quiet. This was not a story for the outside world. It was something they lived with, something they feared. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, the villagers spoke less and less about Supansa. But they never forgot her. How could they? Her presence was etched into the land, as much a part of the village as the ancient trees and the mist that rolled in every evening. She was there, always there, somewhere near the river, waiting. The villagers grew cautious. They warned their children not to go near the river at night, especially when the moon was full. They avoided speaking her name, as if uttering it might bring her closer, might invite her into their homes. But no one could truly avoid her, not for long. The village was small, and the river was the lifeblood of the community. No matter how much they tried, the villagers had to cross its path. One evening, under a clouded sky, an old woman named Molly was making her way home from the market. Her steps were slow, the basket on her back heavy with the day's goods. She had taken this path 1,000 times before, a narrow trail that wound along the river, the waters barely visible beneath the thick brush. But that night, something was different. Molly felt it before she saw anything. The air around her grew colder, the wind sharper, biting at her skin. She paused, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She told herself it was nothing, just the night air, just her old bones reacting to the cold. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, dressed in white. Molly's heart froze. She didn't want to turn her head, didn't want to look at it fully. She knew who it was. Everyone in the village knew the stories. The figure stood still, motionless, just at the edge of her vision, and though she couldn't see its face, she knew it was watching her. She tried to move, but her legs refused to obey. It was as if the very air had wrapped around her, holding her in place, keeping her feet rooted to the ground. The only sound was the rustling of the trees and the faint murmur of the river flowing nearby. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, the figure moved. Molly didn't scream. She couldn't. Her throat was dry, her chest tight with fear. She had never believed the stories, not really. But now, standing there, the figure of the ghost bride just feet away, she knew they were true. All of them. The figure didn't walk. It floated, its feet never touching the ground. Supinya's gown, once beautiful and flowing, now seemed weighed down by the water that had claimed her life. Her long hair, still adorned with the same wilting flowers, clung to her wet, pale skin, and her eyes were empty, hollow, lifeless. But still, they searched, scanned the darkness as if she was looking for something, for someone. Molly managed to wrench her gaze away, her heart pounding in her chest. She stumbled forward, her feet moving as if through mud, slow and heavy. She could hear the soft swish of the gown behind her, the rustle of fabric and waterlogged petals as they dragged across the earth. Molly didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached the village, her legs trembling beneath her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as she stood at the edge of the village, the safety of her home in sight, she could feel it. Supinya was still watching, still waiting. The coldness hadn't left her. It clung to her skin, the same as the night air. Molly was the first villager to speak about seeing the ghost bride in years, but she wouldn't be the last. After Molly's encounter, others began to see Supinya more frequently. The bride didn't just haunt the river anymore. She began appearing in the village itself, on the outskirts at first, but slowly she crept closer, always watching, always waiting. And then one by one, the villagers started to disappear too. It was subtle at first. A child who had gone to play near the river and didn't return. An old man who had taken his daily walk and never came home. Their belongings were found, neatly placed, as though they had simply set them down and walked away. But the people themselves were gone. Supinya's presence wasn't just terrifying, it was heartbreaking. The villagers could feel the weight of her sadness every time she appeared. It wasn't the type of ghost that only caused fear. Her very existence was a testament to the endless grief she carried, a sorrow that seemed to stretch through time, as deep as the river that had taken her life. Some nights they could hear her weeping, a soft, mournful cry carried by the wind, blending with the sounds of the river. The weeping would start quietly, barely more than a whisper in the trees, but as the night deepened, it grew louder, like a wail that pierced through the hearts of those who heard it. The sound brought tears to the eyes of even the hardest men, the ones who had never shed a tear in their lives. They said it wasn't just fear that made her presence unbearable. It was the sadness, the longing, the despair of a bride whose wedding day had become her death. And while the villagers feared her, they pitied her too. She loved him, the elder would say quietly whenever the topic came up. She loved him so much that even death couldn't keep her away. But that love had twisted into something else, something darker. The sorrow she carried had festered over the years, growing more powerful, more dangerous. Now, it wasn't just love or longing that drove her. It was the sheer agony of being separated from the one she had never had the chance to wed. For some of the villagers, Supinya's sorrow reminded them of their own losses, the husbands and wives, the children, the parents who had been taken by the river over the years, the pain of losing someone, the ache that never truly healed. It was as if the river itself was cursed, claiming lives as an offering to the spirit who haunted its banks. They would sit by their fires, their eyes misty with unshed tears, whispering prayers not just for protection, but for Supinya's soul too. They didn't just want her to leave, they wanted her to find peace. But they all knew, deep down, that peace would never come for her. Not as long as Niran was gone. The weight of her grief hung over the village like a cloud, pressing down on everyone who lived there. It made the air feel thick, heavy, as if the sadness itself was something they breathed in with every breath. And yet, there was no escaping it. The villagers spoke of Supinya not just with fear, but with a kind of tragic reverence. She had become more than a ghost. She was a symbol of all the things they couldn't control, of the losses they couldn't stop. Her story had become their story, her sorrow woven into the fabric of their lives. But for Supansa, there was no rest, no end. Her search continued, and with each passing year, it grew more desperate, more painful. The villagers could feel it, and while they feared what she might do next, they also wept for her. For the bride who never got to say her vows, for the love that had been torn away from her, leaving nothing but sorrow in its wake. The fear in the village grew like a shadow, spreading with each new sighting, each new disappearance. There were no explanations, no patterns, only the ghost bride's sorrowful presence, always just beyond the edges of sight. Even the bravest souls, those who dismissed the stories as mere superstition, found themselves growing uneasy as the days wore on. The village was small, and the river even smaller, but Supansa's haunting seemed to stretch far beyond its banks. No one felt safe anymore. One evening, a young couple, newly married and visiting the area for their honeymoon, arrived in the village. They were outsiders, unaware of the stories that clung to the place like a fog. The villagers watched them with wary eyes, but said nothing. There was no need. Soon enough, the couple would learn. On their second night, the couple decided to take a walk by the river. Drawn by the beauty of the moonlit water, they didn't return. The villagers found their belongings neatly arranged by the water's edge, their shoes placed side by side, and their jackets folded over a stone. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle, just the cold, still air of the night and the river's soft murmur. Supansa had claimed them, just as she had claimed so many before. Word spread quietly, the villagers growing more silent with each passing day. The village elder warned them to avoid the river entirely, to stay indoors after dark, but it was no use. Supansa's reach extended beyond the river now. She appeared in dreams, in reflections, in the spaces between shadows. The worst part, the villagers whispered, was not seeing her, but feeling her. They said that sometimes, on the coldest nights, you could feel the weight of her sadness pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the sorrow she carried was too heavy for one spirit to bear. It seeped into the air, into the walls, into the very earth beneath their feet. There was no escaping her. Not anymore. Some of the villagers spoke of leaving, of abandoning the village entirely, but where would they go? This was their home, the only place they had ever known. And so they stayed, living with the fear, with the knowledge that the ghost bride's sorrow had no end, and neither did her search. The few travelers who still passed through the area, those unaware of the danger, would sometimes hear the story in bits and pieces, half-told warnings at the market, a quick glance from a villager who refused to speak her name. But for the most part, the village kept it secret. Supansa would always be there, haunting the river, haunting the land, waiting for the one thing she could never have. Her search for Naran, for the love that had been taken from her, would go on forever, and as long as she wandered, so too would the fear that she brought with her. And for those unfortunate enough to cross her path, there was no escape.